The guy handed over the wine bottle to the woman sitting across from him, almost like he was testing the waters, watching John Jensen's reaction. Once he was sure John wouldn't dare stand up to him, the guy started acting even worse. First, he ran his mouth, throwing insults at John, making him look small. Then, without a second thought, he slid his hand into the woman's dress in a way that left no room for doubt about his intentions. John tried to calm things down, reasoning with the guy, but the man wasn't interested. He clearly had bad intentions from the start. With a revolver pointed straight at John's head, all he could do was stand there, powerless, as his wife was dragged away and humiliated right in front of him. It was heartbreaking, especially with his son witnessing the whole thing. But everyone has a breaking point, and John hit his when he caught his wife's eyes. Speaking softly in their hometown Danish dialect, he told her to bite the thug's ear. It was a desperate move, but it was all he had. And it worked. As the guy yelped in pain and got distracted, John saw his chance and took it. Not wanting to make things bloody right off the bat, John told his son to grab the revolver off the ground. But that decision turned out to be a massive mistake. His son, not knowing what he was doing, accidentally got in John's way at the worst moment. This gave the thug just enough time to grab the boy and hold him hostage with a knife. Just like that, any advantage John had gained was gone. The thug, now in full control again, gave John an ultimatum. 5 seconds to get out of the car or else. Even a tough guy like John, who'd been through hell and back, couldn't hold back the tears. The man kicked John out of the car and sped off, leaving him stranded, his heart breaking for his family. But John didn't give up. He started running after the carriage, even though he knew he couldn't possibly catch up on foot. It didn't matter. He had to try. He ran and ran, not stopping, until he saw something up ahead that made his blood run cold. A body lying on the ground. Dread filled him as he got closer, and his worst fears were confirmed. It was his son. The boy he had only recently reunited with was now gone forever. The pain was indescribable, but there was no time to grieve. John picked up his son's lifeless body and kept moving. Not far ahead, he found the carriage he'd been chasing. The coachman had been killed, his body tossed carelessly to the side of the road. John carefully laid his son down and grabbed the revolver from the ground. After checking that it was loaded, he quietly approached the carriage. One of the thugs was standing watch on the other side. John didn't waste any time. He shot out the lantern, spooking the horses. The thug leaned out to see what was going on, and John fired, hitting him right between the eyes. The second thug, who had been caught off guard, tried to pull up his pants and make a run for it. But John wasn't going to let him get away. He chased him into the woods and took him out with another shot. The once cocky thug, now desperate to survive, started begging for his life. But John wasn't in the mood to forgive. He emptied the revolver on him, fueled by grief and rage. When the dust settled, John returned to the carriage, only to find his wife in a state that shattered his soul. The 10 years he had spent in America, struggling to build a better life for his family, had all led to this nightmare. John's grief was compounded when he realized the danger wasn't over. The thug who had hurt his wife had a brother, Henry Delero, the leader of a local gang. Henry wasn't about to let his brother's death go unanswered. He stormed into town, demanding the mayor and sheriff hand over the killer or face the consequences. He wanted 2 people dead as payment, and if they didn't comply, he threatened to take 4 lives instead. To avoid a massacre, the town leaders decided to sacrifice the oldest person in town first. Her grandson protested, but it was pointless. He had no choice but to watch as his grandmother was taken and killed. Then they dragged a disabled farmer out of his home to serve as the second victim. They hoped this would satisfy Henry, but it didn't. He shot another person, claiming the old woman and the disabled man only counted as one and that the town had disrespected him. To punish them further, he doubled their protection fees, leaving the townsfolk in despair. Meanwhile, John's brother, Peter Jensen, showed up at John's house the next morning, expecting to have breakfast together. Instead, he found the door wide open and no sign of life inside. Worried, he went in with his gun and found the bodies. Without needing to say much, Peter stood by John's side as they buried his wife and son. For the first time, John let his guard down and allowed himself to cry. At the same time, Henry Delero was holding a funeral for his brother. He made a big show of promising to avenge him and take care of his brother's widow. But she saw right through him, knowing he only cared about his own twisted desires. Back in town, John and Peter decided it was time to leave. They planned to sell John's land and move on from the place that had brought them so much pain. But when John tried to sell, the mayor offered him only half its value. That's when John learned the thug who had attacked his wife was Henry Delero's brother, and the increased protection fees had left the town broke. With no other option, John signed over his land. As he left the mayor's office, a couple recognized him. They had been in the carriage that night, sitting across from his family. To save themselves from Henry's wrath, the woman ran to the sheriff to report John. At the same time, the mayor kindly advised John to hide his money in his boot, hinting that trouble was brewing. As John Jensen was about to head out, he felt something wasn't quite right. The street, which was bustling just moments before, had suddenly gone eerily silent. In the distance, 3 armed men were steadily making their way toward him. With no other choice, he darted into a nearby alley, only to walk straight into a trap that had been set up in advance. His escape plan went downhill fast when the sheriff shot his horse, leaving him stranded on the ground. Before he knew it, John was dragged off to the police station, and not long after, Peter Jensen was also thrown into the mix. The detective who brought Peter in didn't stop at capturing him. He roughed him up a bit before tossing him behind bars. John, putting the pieces together, recognized the detective as someone involved in this mess. Without hesitation, he confessed to killing the thug, hoping they'd let Peter go. But the sheriff wasn't interested in negotiating and kept Peter locked up for supposedly assaulting an officer. The next day, a group of Henry Delero's men rolled into town, looking smug as ever. They tied John up in front of the whole town and marched him off while everyone else just stood around, pretending not to see anything. The widow of the man John had killed couldn't bear to watch and walked away, while the woman who had tattled on him looked like she regretted everything. The townspeople, they just stayed quiet, too scared to intervene. At Delero's camp, John finally came face to face with Henry and the thug's widow, Madeleine. Trying to protect the memory of his wife and son, he painfully told the story of what happened. Madeleine, knowing the kind of man her husband was, didn't demand revenge. She simply glanced at John and walked off. But Henry, more interested in winning over Madeleine than anything else, decided to spare John for the time being. As the scorching afternoon heat settled in, the town's mayor showed up unexpectedly at the camp. Instead of asking about John's condition, his first words were, "Can I have his boots?" The mayor, of course, was after the cash John had hidden in his boots from selling his land. Meanwhile, back in town, the chapel bells rang, calling everyone to prayer. With almost everyone gone, only the deputy remained to guard Peter Jensen. Tired of Peter's relentless sarcasm and insults, the deputy's patience snapped. Later that night, Henry, after getting cozy with Madeleine, promised her they'd leave together once the town's land was secured. He had no clue that an uninvited guest had already snuck into his camp. A patrolman noticed something was off when he saw a lantern swaying in the distance. By the time he investigated, it was too late. The guard was already dead. Peter Jensen had used the distraction to free John and hide him. Then, Peter dealt with the returning patrol team, taking them down swiftly. As rain poured down, Peter made a daring escape on horseback with an unconscious John slumped over. Henry, furious at being outsmarted, sent his men after them. During the chase, John kept slipping off the horse, forcing Peter to make a tough call. Knowing they couldn't outrun their pursuers, Peter hid John in a pile of rocks and led the men away, sacrificing himself to give John a chance. The next morning, John woke up, dazed and thirsty. He drank from a muddy puddle without a second thought, only to hear the sound of horses approaching. He quickly hid, gun in hand. Peering out from behind a rock, his heart sank. Peter was being dragged behind a horse, lifeless. After losing his family just days ago, John had now lost his closest friend. Consumed by rage, John vowed to make every one of the thugs pay. John returned to Delara's camp to find chaos. Guards had been killed, and the safe was emptied. Madeleine, the only one who knew the safe's combination, had made her escape on a train. Thinking she was finally free, her relief was short-lived when Delara's men stopped the train and dragged her back to camp. Despite his supposed affection for her, Henry decided to offer her to his men to maintain their loyalty. Meanwhile, John, now recovered thanks to the kindness of a farm widow, set out for revenge. He cornered the mayor, forcing him to admit his part in the scheme with Delara. After getting what he needed, John made sure the mayor wouldn't cause more trouble. Teaming up with Wojciech Borowski, who had his own reasons for hating Delara, John put his plan into motion. The two men created chaos at the camp, setting fires and taking out guards. Wojciech, despite being part of the distraction, returned with kerosene to help John. Tragically, he was gunned down, but not before spilling the fuel, which set more of the camp ablaze. As the chaos unfolded, John seized the moment to take out more of Delara's men. In the final confrontation, John faced Henry Delara. Just as Henry was about to pull the trigger, a shot rang out. Madeleine, still holding onto a glimmer of defiance, had fired. This gave John the opening he needed to finish Henry off. As the dust settled, the town sheriff arrived, trying to take credit for the victory. But John and Madeleine, having survived together, stood firm. They decided to leave the town and its painful memories behind, hoping to find peace elsewhere. And so, their story ends. Two broken souls finding solace in each other as they set off into the unknown.